Hello, everyone. I have chosen Tony Kushner's play Angels in America Millennium Approaches for my drama project. A 2024 article from Loveland Studies in Modern Languages and Literature explains how in 1991, when this play was written, the AIDS epidemic was hitting its peak in America. It was incredibly devastating to the gay community, and not many gay people at the time could say that they did not know anyone who had died of AIDS. With the spread of the illness came the spread of stigma and fear, as the disease was completely misunderstood by the general public. Through the queer and gender studies lens, the audience can see how Angels in America Millennium Approaches confronts the failures caused by Reagan-era conservatism and unveils that how the administration's silence and homophobia worsened the AIDS epidemic. The power this play holds in its portrayal of AIDS as not only a horrific health crisis, but a deeper national crisis of political and cultural identity challenges Kushner's audience to confront our nation's deep ties between sexuality, power, and national identity. So let's get into the historical backdrop a little bit. The University of California Press explains in an article titled AIDS, The Burdens of History uncovers how the previous administration led by Ronald Reagan, who was president when the CDC reported the first cases of AIDS in 1981, has been widely criticized for their lack of direct action, which likely worsened the spread of misinformation throughout the general public and led to preventable deaths. A 1987 article published by St. Martin's Press and the band Played On, Politics, People, and the AIDS Epidemic, explains that Ronald Reagan is known for only speaking out on the epidemic in 1987 after tens of thousands of Americans had already died. Deborah Gold, in her article titled Moving Politics, Emotion, and ACT UP's Fight Against AIDS, published to the University of Chicago Press, talks about the activist groups like ACT UP and Gay Men's Health Crisis, who argued that more federal funding was needed to be allocated for AIDS research and treatment as AIDS deaths continued to rise. So now that we've laid kind of the foundations of the politics and the health crisis that was going on in America at the time, let's get into just a quick summary of the play. In Act 1 of Angels in America Millennium Approaches, Tony Kushner introduces us to Roy Cohn in Scene 2, a famous and powerful lawyer who is a closeted queer man who offers Joe Pitt a job in Washington, D.C., working under the Reagan administration. We quickly learn that Joe Pitt, the Mormon lawyer, is also closeted. In Scene 3, Louis Ironson and Pryor Walter come into the picture as an openly gay couple. Pryor has AIDS and displays his first legion to Louis, who begins to question how much he is able and willing to take on in caring for Pryor. In scenes 4 and 5, we then meet Harper Pitt, Joe's wife, who is suspicious that Joe is gay, and Harper struggles with prescription drug use and hallucinations as a result of the breakdown of her marriage. During the first scene of Act 2, Pryor's condition worsens, and Louis is overwhelmed by fear and guilt. Harper and Pryor find each other in a prophetic vision where they share a hallucination during the third scene. And in Scene 4, Roy visits his doctor, who informs him that he has AIDS. Roy is up in arms and ferociously denies that he is homosexual and insists that he must have liver cancer. Louis is criticized by someone he confides in that he feels he cannot stay to take care of Pryor. Belize points out the hypocrisy in his values in Scene 5. And during the 7th scene, Pryor's visions become more intense, and he believes that he will soon be visited by an angel. In Act 3, Louis has abandoned Pryor in his time of need and begins seeing Joe Pitt in Scene 1. In Scene 2, Pryor runs into and confides in Belize, who offers him solidarity. And in Scene 3, Roy's illness progresses. Harper confronts Joe again in Scene 4, who finally admits his attraction to men, but struggles with what that means for his religious and political beliefs. During Scene 5, Harper's mental health deteriorates as she distances herself from her husband Joe, and Pryor has his most powerful vision yet, where the angel visits him and declares that he is a prophet who must stop change. Pryor states that the world only spins forward. Finally, the play ends on Scene 7, with Pryor insisting on surviving AIDS, leaving the audience with the line, "The great work begins." I will now take some time to analyze some character case studies from the play. The 2024 article published by Loveland Studies in Modern Languages and Literature mentioned earlier explains how Pryor Walter is one of the main characters in Angels in America Millennium Approaches. He is a gay man who is actively dying of AIDS. He is unable and unwilling to hide his condition, demanding recognition and understanding through his suffering. Pryor's plight highlights the way queer people were politicized and stigmatized throughout the epidemic. David Sevran from the Theater Journal describes how, despite his condition, he refuses to be seen as a victim and continues to live, love, and speak out to the best of his ability. His prophetic visions place him in a position of spiritual authority rather than the general stereotype that queer men were a powerless fringe minority. His role as a prophet visited by angels challenges the traditional conservative associations of holiness and heterosexuality. It is through Pryor's experiences that reframes AIDS as a cultural turning point when the queer community demanded recognition and transformation and challenges heteronormative social structures. Next, we'll move on to Lewis Ironson, Pryor's partner, who finds himself unable to face the reality of Pryor's deteriorating condition. He is taken over by fear when confronted with Pryor's lesions and weakness, which Anna Bendrat states is representative of the widespread cultural panic and stigma surrounding AIDS during the 1980s. Sevran argues that Lewis shows the audience how stigma surrounding AIDS was able to tear apart queer relationships. He struggles with the responsibility of becoming a caretaker and is unable to take on the traditionally male, strong protector gender role. In Pryor's moment of need, this goes to show how gender roles are performative and often crumble under pressure. Lewis's decision to abandon Pryor as he lay dying of AIDS was not only personal but political. Bendrat reminds us that many queer relationships of the time fell apart under the fear and stigma of AIDS and the burden caregiving can present. He often comes across as hypocritical when he openly critiques Reagan-era conservatism, but can't step up to the plate for his own partner, according to Sevran. Next, we have Harper Pitt, who finds herself stuck in an unhappy marriage with the closeted gay Mormon lawyer, Joe Pitt. Through her relationship with Joe, she becomes very isolated while her needs and desires are brushed under the rug. Harper represents Adrian Rich's concept of compulsory heterosexuality, which he coined in a publication titled Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Experience, a gender studies perspective that points out how women are often forced into roles that they don't have a choice in. Sevran's 1995 article in Theater Journal analyzes how Harper experiences the same type of hallucinations that Pryor did, but while his are seen as prophetic, hers are written off as madness or mental illness. The difference in their treatment points out how gender forms the basis of legitimate spiritual or visionary authority. In the way that her suffering is directly linked to Joe's closeted identity, she also represents how queer denial not only harms the queer individual themselves, but also destabilizes their heterosexual partners. Pryor's fluidity aligns with queer theory's criticism of fixed identity categories, as he resists tight-knit definitions of gender, sexuality, and sacredness. Kushner uses Harper to show how women were also victims of Reagan-era conservatism, as he shows her struggle with her identity as a Mormon housewife who becomes addicted to Valium and fantasies of escape. When Harper and Pryor meet in a dreamlike setting during a prophetic vision suggesting that queer men and isolated women are connected through this shared experience of inclusion and visionary insight, Harper shows us that Reagan-era conservatism played an important role in the regression of gender and identity across the nation. Roy Cohn is one of those characters that will really make you shake your head, but his actions serve an important purpose. Roy Cohn is known as a shark of a lawyer who insists that while he does have sex with men, he is not homosexual. He is the epitome of Eve Sedgwick's idea of epistemology of the closet, in the way he uses the closet as a political tool that allows him to hold onto his authority in a predominantly heteronormative environment. He exaggerates his role as an aggressive and domineering man in the way that he acts towards others as if he is trying to further affirm to himself that he's a tough man who doesn't fall into queer stereotypes. This aligns with Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity, which she describes in her work titled Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, that gender as a construct created through repeated acts rather than fixed essence. He contracts AIDS, he insists that he has liver cancer instead because he believed only queer people could get AIDS and he was still denying his identity as a queer man. A major contrast to Pryor Walter, who goes on to represent resilience through his suffering and refuses to hide what is happening to him. Roy Cohn shows the audience that queer identity can be repressed and weaponized, critiquing how the closet can allow oppressive politics to reign over queer individuals. So let's take a second to go over some of the themes that can be found throughout this play. So, one theme we can talk about is illness and identity, where Bandrat examines how AIDS made the suffering of queer people undeniable, represented through lesions, weakness, and hospitalization. This is shown in the way that Prior Walter's illness forces recognition of queer suffering, turning his body into a symbol of stigma and resilience. In the 1980s, part of the stigma surrounding AIDS was the belief that if someone became noticeably sick, they must be queer, creating an unbreakable link between illness and identity. David Sevran's essay analyzes how this leads to Roy insisting he has liver cancer instead of AIDS. If he acknowledges that he has AIDS, he would have to acknowledge that he is queer. Whereas Pryor's diagnosis leads him to become a figure of resilience and spiritual significance. His identity didn't make him weak, it allowed him to transform suffering into authority. Or the way that Harper's hallucinations were seen as madness, while Pryor's were considered prophetic, is an example of how one's gender might decide the legitimacy of one's illness. The AIDS epidemic created a national identity crisis where concerns grew for America's moral decay and who really counts as an American. Next up in themes, we have angels and visions. The angels described in Kushner's play are described with both masculine and feminine characteristics, a representation of Judith Butler's concept on gender performativity. This also implies a connection between divinity and queer identity, according to Sevran. Prophetic visions that come to Pryor during his hardest times transform him from patient to prophet. Sevran goes on to point out that when Harper and Pryor meet in the same prophetic realm, their plight as a marginalized woman suffering in the heteronormative ideals she was molded to fit and a queer man stigmatized by AIDS are intertwined. By creating a character who reaches divine prophecy, Kushner questions the exclusion of queer people from religious culture. It represents resistance and truth. Next up, we have national identity and queerness. Sevran also argues how Tony Kushner's play makes the point that queer identity is central to America's story. Reagan-era conservatism praised family values and heteronormativity as the foundation of American identity. The Reagan administration's silence during the epidemic makes it clear that queer people were not a part of his vision of America. Queer people became political symbols in stigma, fear, and activism as a result of the AIDS crisis. Sedgwick's concept of the closet was wielded as a tool to maintain national myths of strength and purity. Kushner's work blurs the line between pure, unpure, male, female roles, straight, queer stereotypes. He does this by portraying angels with no firm gender, as well as through Pryor's refusal to cooperate with the angel's command, Lewis's abandonment of Pryor, and Roy's denial of his own sexual identity. Next, we have performativity. Looking closer at Judith Butler's idea that gender and identity are not innate but performed through repeated acts, we can see that Kushner uses this concept in his play to show the cracks in the foundation of these constructions. Lewis's masculine facade cracks when he finds himself unable to take on the role of Pryor's caretaker. Roy's denial of his own sexuality, paired with his performative masculinity and domineering attitude, shows how his identity is enacted through repeated acts. Sedgwick's epistemology of the closet explores the idea that disclosure and denial are both performances. This can be seen in Roy when he denies his homosexuality in order to maintain his reputation and political affiliation. And Joe Pitt is seen performing as a highly conservative Mormon lawyer who hides his same-sex relationships, an example of a performance of religious and national identity. In conclusion, Angels in America, Millennium Approaches is a drama that centers illness, queerness, and identity as national issues rather than private struggles. The way that Reagan-era conservatism failed the public during the AIDS epidemic is made clear to the audience. Kushner creates characters like Pryor, Lewis, Harper, and Roy, and tools to portray the performative nature of identity and unveil the cracks in the foundations of traditional concepts of gender, sexuality, and nationhood. The prophetic visions and visits from divine beings that played a central role in this narrative places queer identity as an important part of America's culture. Kushner's enduring message that AIDS was a cultural turning point in America's history, where the public was forced to face the realities of sexuality, power, and national identity, Pryor leaves with a call to action, to change, and to be resilient in the face of struggle and injustice. He leaves us with hope, telling us that through great work, great change